In today's gospel reading, our Lord emphasizes the importance of interior cleansing ourselves or purifying ourselves interiorly. We know the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, were very good at observing the external precepts of the law. To all appearances, they looked good. In fact, they were considered the most religious at the time. However, our Lord often points out their lack of correct interior disposition, their lack of charity. In this case, our Lord says that inside they are full of greed and wickedness. Greed, desire for wealth, desire to have possessions, desire to have more than others, or just a desire to have more than what you already have. So when it comes to interior dispositions, we're not as aware of our interior dispositions as we might be of our external actions. Sometimes even with our external actions, we say something foolish or we act inappropriately or we're rude, and sometimes we're not even aware of it. But it's even more so that when it comes to our interior dispositions or interior thoughts, we're even less aware of those. We reflect on those less. So we need to reflect on this. We need to enter into ourselves to examine what is my interior disposition. And it's interesting that the world that we live in today, we're just extremely busy. People are always on their cell phones, social media, or there's noise, television is on, or the radio's on. It's kind of like people don't have time to reflect. And I think this is especially true for young people who spend so much time on social media or video games or whatever it may be. And in order to truly reflect on the meaning of our lives, we need time. We need time to reflect. We need to have that quiet space, that time, even if we're not necessarily praying to God. Now, of course, to pray to God, we also need quiet time. We need to withdraw from the busyness, the distractions of this world. And especially this applies for young people. And in the past, this was kind of part of nature. Like it would be quiet at night, for example. Imagine people living in the days when we didn't have modern technology the way that we do now. No television, let's say, or no TV. What did people do? Well, they talked. They shared stories, they talked about important things, they related things, but they had the time to reflect. Even when they went to work or when they had to go somewhere, they would often walk, and this gave them opportunities to reflect, to contemplate, to consider what is the meaning of life, but also to consider, okay, what are my interior dispositions? So in other words, they were much more likely to be aware of their interior dispositions because they spent more time in quiet, in reflection. And this is actually a good thing. So what I'm saying is we need to do this also. Otherwise, we're not going to be aware of our interior dispositions. Now, notice in today's first reading, Paul's letter to the Romans. He begins by saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Now, why would he be ashamed of the gospel? Like it's foolish for him to say that. Well, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. But there's a reason he's saying that. What he's really trying to say is, look, the gospel that we believe in is just so marvelous, it's so wonderful. There's absolutely no need for shame regarding it. And the things about God, God, it's clear from nature that nature could not just have come about by chance, but there had to be a God who created nature, so the invisible God who has manifested himself through the visible things of reality. And when you look at the philosophers of old, they wrote in their writings that, God has to exist, that these things could not have come about by chance. So these philosophers enunciated these truths, but the average person would have understood this. The average person, especially when they have time to reflect and contemplate, they know that there is a God. So once again, going back to the importance of contemplation. But then he goes on to say that even though deep down people know that God exists, so they have no excuse, and yet they create for themselves, they exchange the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. So not just the fact that they're making idols, but when you make an idol of a human being, basically saying that God is a human being, maybe an exalted human being. Now we might say, well, nobody would believe that today. Actually, the Mormons do believe that. They believe that God has a human body, that if he's human, well, he must have human parents also, and it's kind of an infinite regression of gods or beings, and so this particular being is God over the planet Earth, and he's just looks exactly like us. So exchanging the glory of the immortal God, the immaterial God, for what is finite, for what is created. Like, how foolish can you be? This is what St. Paul is saying. It's these people who should be ashamed. So he's saying, look, I'm not ashamed. They don't claim to be ashamed, but they should be ashamed. This is what he's saying. Now, we might say, okay, well, that may have applied to people at the time of St. Paul or at the time of our Lord. There were these pagan nations who had idols and images that they worshipped. But you see, the reality is that even today, we create idols for ourselves, not physical idols, but in a sense, we put our trust in these false gods, these false idols. So, our Lord in today's gospel reading, he talks about greed and wickedness. Well, greed, the love of money. You make an idol of money. You make an idol of wealth. How many times a day do you maybe think of winning the lottery, right? Well, you're putting your hope into that. So in other words, what's our interior disposition? Am I really attached to wealth? Do I really want it? Or it might be other things, pride, vanity, being judgmental of others, looking down upon others, being rude and not even noticing that we're being like that. So what's our interior disposition? Getting back to that, right? And, when it comes to sin, right? Adoring the sin, making an idol of the sin, making your life revolve around the sin. For some people, it might be drugs. Some people, it might be pornography. It could be different things. So the reality is that it does apply even today, that people create a God for themselves. And when we think of society moving away from belief in God, what's also interesting is that now they're more open to New Age practices, witchcraft, Satanism, because they've created a void for themselves. And it's also noteworthy and interesting that not just interiorly, but even openly, these people who believe that mankind is the greatest intellect on the earth or the greatest intellect in the universe, right? That we could do whatever we want. We have the technology, we have the science, we can make a male into a female, and we can do all these things. We could do whatever we want. We're making ourselves into a god. So in other words, even today, this worship of mankind, the human intellect, the human achievements that have been accomplished, and the progress that we're making in technology, and this belief that, we are supreme. We can do whatever we want. I can do whatever I want. Becoming our own gods. Or seeing mankind as a god. Now, in one sense, yes, we're rulers of the earth, and God has given us the ability to manage technology and all these things, but we are not God. And we cannot play God. And if we do, it's just going to bring misery and disaster upon ourselves. So what is our interior disposition? I need to examine that. And I need to spend time in that. Sometimes when we go to prayer, sometimes people complain about distractions, and sometimes there's good reason for those distractions, but the reality is that most people tend to be distracted at some point for whatever reason. It's not necessarily wrong, it's just part of human nature. But sometimes we might be distracted towards sinful things. And when we notice that, especially during our prayer time, that might be a good indication that, okay, maybe I'm really attached to this sinful thing. That's why I'm being distracted. Even though I catch myself and say, okay, I'm not going to go there. Maybe there's still some attachment there. So we need to purify ourselves. We need to cleanse ourselves interiorly. Sure, it's good to look good exteriorly, to, shower and comb our hair or whatever. But how about interiorly? Yes, we need to go to confession, but in addition to that, we need to purify those inordinate inclinations, especially if they are sinful inclinations. Just a reminder, we have a funeral today at 10:30 for Flory de Souza. May her soul and the souls of all the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace.